And I will go ahead and do the first attendance word for you guys who are here early. This one's for extra credit. And the word is humid. You know, like hot and humid outside, Humid. Humid is the first word, and it is for extra credit. Don't forget to send me those words before 9 a.m. I know at least one person per day logs on, but then doesn't send the words, which I feel bad for you, because if you did sit through it, then hopefully you would want credit for doing so. What are some other reminders? If you're watching the video, not you guys right now, not anyone who's live, if you're watching this video later, then that extra credit word I just said is not extra credit. It's just one of your words. But what are some other reminders? So if you remember, you were allowed to retake the first 3 exams, but you have to let me know when you're done, right? I'm going to average your first grade and your last grade, and that'll be your new grade. But I have no way of knowing that it's been done unless you email me and let me know that you're ready for me to change your grade. And the same can be said for corrections on labs, right? So if you corrected a lab, I have no way of knowing that you're ready for me to grade it unless you leave a comment or reply to one of my comments and let us know that you're ready for us to grade it. See, what are some other good announcements and reminders? Final exam will be next week. It'll be about 100 questions. You'll have exactly 100 minutes to take it. About 50 of the questions will come directly from the first 3 exams, and about 50 questions will come from the new chapters, starting with evolution. I think that's it. Oh, yeah, and as usual, if you need more time to take it, if you can arrange a time to meet me online so I can ensure that you're taking a closed book exam, then we can extend the time limit. Morning.
Ain't working for you.
This has been great, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no problem at all.
No, I couldn't remember if it was the first time you had it since
Yep.
I gave it to you down here in this room or not.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay, because I should have worked the same, but I thought I did.
Speaking of which, what do I do about, since you're here,
Uh-huh.
I tried rebooting it, thinking out to fix it, but now these days, the microphone and the camera they just don't work anymore. This is why and the mic, it's on. Of course, I turned that off and on too, but
Yeah, I think it's that one.
yeah. It just didn't, I know, I didn't do it today because I've been doing it and it just doesn't fix it. But I'm using that for my mic, and I don't necessarily need the camera. So, yeah, I make it work, but
I might check it out after Tim's right after you.
Yeah.
I'll check it out later, see what I can find out. It's probably something in the way somebody's unhooked.
Yeah, probably.
I feel it.
No problem. I meant to tell you earlier. I've just been, every time I leave here, I forget about it. All right. All right, 2 minutes left. I'm going to start attendance. And I kind of moved my phone, which is my microphone. So I know you've already done it before, but can someone online again confirm that you can hear me?
I can hear you.
I can hear you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to do, again, I'm going to do attendance. If you're online and I say you're not here, don't worry about it. Again, just send the words when we're done. Abigail is here. in person. Kincaid is online. Andrea, not here. Mullins, not here. Lewis is online. Cooper is online. Hunter is online. Caleb is here. Crowder is not here. Reinhardt is not here. Isabel is here in person. Julia is online. Talbert is not here. Kennedy is here in person. Hannah is online. Larissa is online. Madeline is here in person. Hughes is online. Galloway is online. Cook is online. Morgan is not here. Tate is online. Burton is online. Kinder, not here. Canterbury, not here. Hobson, not here. And Fisher is online. So everybody in person is accounted for. Again, if you're online and I didn't call your name, obviously don't worry about it. Just send the words. Well, it's 8. Let's get started. Hopefully we can knock this out in time. This is our last week of class, guys. Hope you're excited. Okay. It is, isn't it? I'm not getting confused. I'm pretty sure that's right. I was very confident in that until you asked. Yeah, so I'll look. No, I'm pretty sure, yeah, because Module 6, my online class has finished Module 6, which means they're starting Module 7 this week, and Module 8 is the last. Yeah, so this is the last week of class. Next week's your finals. Anyway, let's jump into it. Back into it quickly, hopefully. The first word for attendance will be people. Right there. Anyway, this is where we left off. We were talking about disturbances. I'll actually back up one step. First thing we mentioned was that, we use that example. A lot of times, small-scale disturbances are beneficial. Basically, they increase biodiversity by, basically increasing the diversity of the ecosystems, right? So I used that example last week where there's new ecosystems because that tree fell down. But then after we talked about that, we went on to talk about how humans are the most significant cause of ecological disturbances, and sometimes they are not good, right? So yes, small-scale ones, like I just talked about with that tree falling down, are very often good, but usually when humans are involved, it's not good. Excuse me. And this is what we left off talking about, right? We talked about emerging diseases, right? So COVID, for example, or the virus that causes COVID-19, we think jumped from bats to humans because, we're encroaching in their territory, right? So that's one of the hypotheses anyway. Yeah, so basically common sense tells you as the human population grows and we start growing into other areas with other animals, then we're going to get new diseases. So probably this whole COVID-19 thing will not be the last of them. Anyway, any questions about that? All right, so let's talk about something called ecological succession. Hopefully you already know what succession, that word means. When you're not in biology, that can mean something, for example, like when the president dies, right? Then the vice president takes over. And if the vice president dies, then I think it's the Speaker of the House takes over, so on and so forth, right? That would be succession politically. But ecological succession is when there's a big disturbance and a lot of life is wiped out, basically. And then we're talking about what life comes back, right? What life takes place of the old life that was killed. Or was the, excuse me, as this says, communities change drastically following a severe disturbance that strips away vegetation and soil, right? So a fire, maybe, or a flood, a volcano, right? That would be big disturbances, right? So again, once you've kind of wiped off what used to live there, you're kind of starting new. And that area is then colonized by a variety of species, gradually being replaced by a succession of other species, and that process is called ecological succession. So you do need to know what ecological succession is. I might ask you about it. There's going to be different types, and we'll talk about that here in a second. And most likely that's what the question is going to be, is asking you to differentiate between the two different types of ecological succession. Are there any questions so far? Again, we're going to talk more about it here in a second. All right.
So the first type is called primary succession. And that is succession in a virtually lifeless area. So we're talking about a really big disturbance, right? So again, this is a great example. This picture is after a volcano, and that's what that rock is, right? That rock used to be lava. It cooled. So as you can imagine, it wiped out, killed everything, right? And all you had left was rock. And now you can see that there's actually, I don't know what that species is actually, but some kind of plant has colonized it, right? And those are the first species to colonize that area. But again, what do you need to know for the exam for primary succession? This is a case when there's no life, right? There's no life at all. There's no soil. So, yeah. Any questions about primary succession? All right. Secondary succession is the other one that's pretty simple. It's like primary succession, except it's when it wasn't all the life that was lost, right? So we still keep the soil. So a great example of that would be a flood, right, or a fire. So you can see that picture down there. There's been a forest fire, but you can see things are starting to grow back. And that's what secondary succession is. So any questions about that? All right, the next word for attendance, I'm going to underline. There it is. Well, and point at it. So it's just the one word. That underline got a little wonky. All right, moving forward quickly. Let's talk about ecosystem ecology. Ecosystem ecology. First of all, again, I need to remind you what an ecosystem is. An ecosystem was basically a community, right? So we're looking at all the living things in an area that are interacting with each other. Those are the biotic factors. But it also includes abiotic factors. So now if we're looking at an ecosystem as opposed to a community, now we're not just looking at the living things and how they interact with each other, but we also look at things that are non-living and how the living things interact with the non-living things and how the non-living things impact the living things. So for example, energy, right? So solar energy, right? So we need primary consumers, we need producers to take that sun energy, turn it to the chemical energy of glucose. We've learned about that earlier in the semester. Soil characteristics, right? Is it sandy? Is it more like clay? Is it loamy? What's the pH? How much water is there? Anything that's not living that affects living things is all included in ecosystems. So any questions about what an ecosystem is? All right. I'm not going to ask you what a terrarium is, but this is from your old textbook, and it's a really, really good example. It's a really good way of visualizing what an ecosystem is. So really quickly, we'll talk about what a terrarium is. It's a community that interacts with abiotic factors. So again, it's like a little ecosystem, but it's self-contained. It's a small-scale ecosystem, which I said is why it's a great model for how actual ecosystems work. Because even at this small level, we can talk about energy flow and chemical cycling, and you definitely need to know this. This will definitely be a test question. Energy flows through an ecosystem, but chemicals are cycled, right? So energy flows through, but matter stays in an ecosystem, right? Now, granted, that's not exactly 100% accurate, and all depends on what you're calling an ecosystem. But we'll talk about that later. But that's the good basic way of describing it. And this is what I mean by that, right? Energy's flowing through. It comes in as light energy. And if you remember from way back in the beginning of the semester, we talked about how every time you switch energy from one form to another, you lose some of it as heat. And that's exactly what happens here. And you might not think about that. When you think about a plant growing, you don't think about it giving off heat, but it is. And you can see in these other things in the ecosystem, like this snail, right? So as it goes through respiration, it's giving off heat. Same with this worm. But yes, again, for the exam, the concept here is that energy flows through an ecosystem, but ultimately, for the most part, matter is recycled, especially in a terrarium, definitely in a terrarium. But if we're talking about the bigger picture in actual ecosystems, then it's slightly true. There are exceptions. Anyway, any questions about this slide? All right. So energy flow and chemical cycling involve the transfer of substances through trophic levels. So remember, we talked about the trophic levels. Remember that pyramid where we started down there at the bottom was the producers. Oh, man, I hate this thing so much. It's supposed to be a P. Producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, so on and so forth, right? Those are the trophic levels. So again, now we're talking about it again, but now we're specifically looking how energy flows through and then out the ecosystem, right? So it starts with the sun, right, goes to the producers, and the energy flows up and basically out of the ecosystem, right? But again, chemicals are recycled within and between ecosystems for the most part. And again, there are exceptions, but think about Earth, right? For the most part, we're not getting much new stuff on Earth. Occasionally we get hit with a meteor or something like that. And for the most part, we're not putting stuff out into space relative to how much stuff is on Earth. But yes, basically Earth is a giant terrarium when you think about it. So let's talk about these energy and flow in ecosystems. As you already know from, what was that, exam 2, I think, exam 3, we talked a lot about this, that all organisms require energy, right? That's part of one of the things that makes us alive. So if we take a closer look at the energy flow through ecosystems, we can answer questions like, why are there so few top-level carnivores, relative to how many lower-level carnivores or even consumers there are. So, for example, when you see those nature shows, you see those lions out there hunting gazelles and zebras, right? There's a ton of those, but there's only a few lions, right? So we can kind of answer that question here in a few. How can we apply energy flow concepts to use our resources efficiently, right? So talking about humans, right? Again, like we mentioned last week, the human population is still growing rapidly, not as rapidly as it used to, but it's still expected to get very big. So we need to be very efficient, especially if you guys did the lab, which is a good time to remind you. Remember, lab 12 is past due as of Friday, so make sure you get that done. But anyway, so yeah, you should know that when it comes to resources, right, that has a lot to do with your carbon footprint and your ecological footprint and all that. So here we go. Let's talk about primary production. Again, this is a concept we've already talked about throughout the semester. We're just bringing it back and looking at it from a different context. Here's a number that you do not need to know. So I'm going to put an next to it, but I'm going to talk about it very quickly. But yeah, I'm not going to ask you this on the exam unless it's extra credit. But the Earth gets about 10 to the 19th power of kilocalorie of solar energy per day. That is a lot. You might not know how much that is, but you could look it up. Maybe write an independent work paper for it if you want, if I have time to grade it. But it's a lot, right? So you could compare that, like how much energy was given off when the Hiroshima bomb exploded, right, compared to how much energy that is. That should give you a good guess about how much energy we're talking about. But anyway, of all that energy, which is a lot of it, most of it is absorbed, scattered, or reflected by the atmosphere or the surface, right? So most of that is not even used. Only about 1% of that is converted to chemical energy by photosynthesis. So that is a number that you might need to know. About 1% of all the sun that hits the planet is actually put to use by plants and algae and things like that, right? Photoautotrophs. So any questions about that slide? All right. It's our next word for attendance. That one on that bullet point right there that I just circled. The biomass. This is a word that you need to know. Maybe I'll test you on it, but definitely I'll use it again. Biomass is the amount of living organic material in an ecosystem, right? So basically, if we were calling this room an ecosystem, the biomass, the best way to calculate the biomass in here would be for just all of us to get on a scale, weigh ourselves, and then add it all up. Of course, there's other stuff living in here that we have to account for too, like mold and bacteria and stuff like that. But yeah, biomass is the amount of living organic material in an ecosystem. Another word you might need to know, well, you definitely need to know it. I might ask you, but you definitely need to know it because we're going to use it. And we've used it before, so again, this is a repeat. Primary production. That is the rate that producers convert solar energy to chemical energy stored in biomass. In a sense, you could almost think of this as like what you did for the lab, the photosynthesis lab. In a sense, we're kind of talking about the rate of photosynthesis, right? We're talking about the rate at which these photosynthetic organisms are turning carbon dioxide and water into glucose. And you don't need to know this number, so I'll put an X through here. Primary production on Earth yields about 165 billion tons of biomass per year. So it's a lot. And then your book also points out that different ecosystems vary considerably in their primary production, and therefore their contribution to that number, that 165, right? So that's probably common sense. You maybe never even thought of it, but think about it now. Think about like a desert, right? It's bare, there's a lot of sand, there's not much living there, and compare that in your brain to like the Amazon rainforest, right? So different ecosystems obviously have different rates of primary production. Any questions about this slide? All right, and there's some examples. And again, I'll put a big old X through this. This is from the old textbook, if I remember correctly. But it shows you which ones are the more productive and least productive, right? So in the ocean, algae beds and coral reefs are very productive. Meanwhile, the open ocean is not very productive. And on land, tundra lost an A, but anyway, on land, tropical rainforest, very productive, right? Deserts and semi-desert scrubs that are very unproductive. I will say this, I shouldn't have put it next to that. That was a little bit preemptive here. Anyway, if I do ask you anything here from this, here's what you would need to know. Just the big ones, right? So you would need to know when it comes to water, open ocean is the least productive, and algae beds and coral reefs are the most productive. And when it comes to land, you would need to know the least productives are desert, semi-desert, and the most productives are tropical rainforests, right? So if anything, again, I would just ask you the big ones, right? I'm not going to ask you to list everything in between. And another thing I might do, I probably wouldn't do this either, but I could maybe provide you with that graph and ask some really easy question like, how productive is tundra, right? And then you just look at the graph and say, okay, well, that's right there, so that looks to be about, I don't know, 200, right? Anyway, any questions about that? All right, we're making good time. Ecological pyramids. Again, this is a concept we've talked about earlier in this chapter, but now we're going to look at it from a different point of view, right? So this should look familiar for you. Plants, i.e. Producers, right? We already talked about this, what we call the producers, the herbivores being the primary consumers, the predators being the secondary consumers, so on and so forth, right? We've already talked about this. But now we're saying it again, but again, reminding you, this new information was just that the energy flows basically up and out the ecosystem, right? It starts with the producers and works its way up to the top predator, at which point it's lost, right? And it loses some every step of the way, which is why it has that shape. That's why it's a pyramid, right? So we're looking at biomass, right? So this trophic structure also basically illustrates the biomass. So in any ecosystem, most of the biomass is going to be plants, and you're going to have a smaller amount of biomass of herbivores, smaller amount of predators, and even smaller amount of top predators. So let's talk about this some more before I take some questions. In most ecosystems, herbivores can eat only part of the plant material produced. Actually, let me back up. Before I talk about this, let me back up one step, give you the big picture. What we're about to describe here is why. Like, why is it so big at the bottom? Why is there so much biomass at the bottom and such a small amount of biomass at the very top? Same with energy. Why is there so much energy available at the bottom and not so much at the top? So that's what we're about to talk about. Here we go. So again, in most ecosystems, herbivores eat only a part of the plant material, right? So you've got all these plants, right? But then you have the things that are eating them. Well, most of the plants in an ecosystem are not getting eaten, right? Most of the biomass anyway. So we have a lot of plants that aren't eaten to begin with. And then the ones that are eaten, right? So we're talking about the herbivore. They can't digest everything that they consume. So yes, they're eating all that biomass, but as you know, when animals eat, they also poop, basically, right? But they can't digest it all. They can't keep all that matter, and they can't keep all that energy either, right? So some of it is just lost for when they poop. And your textbook actually got pretty specific about that and noted that a caterpillar feeding on leaves passes about 1/2 of the energy as feces, right, as poop. So if it's eating 100 calories, it's pooping out 50 of them, right? So again, of the food that it eats and of the food that it can digest, again, only about half that energy passes as feces. And then 35% of it is expended in cellular respiration, right? So 35% of the half that it keeps is gone already, just for living, right? Just to make ATP. And then about 15% of it is transformed into the actual caterpillar biomass. So again, of the stuff that it ate and digested, only about 15% of that matter is actually put into the body of the caterpillar. So it's only the biomass and the energy that it contains that are available to the consumer, right? That's a long story short. You do not need to know any of those details. The point here is that this is why when we go from one level of, let me back up a sec again. This is why when you go from one level to the next, right, when you go from plants to herbivores and then from herbivores to predators, this is why there's so much less energy available to the next level and why there's so much less biomass available to the next level, right? That's just an example of why it is the way it is. Any questions about that? All right. So here's kind of a picture of what we're saying, right? So there's the plant material. We've got the caterpillar eating it. And again, just to keep numbers easy, let's assume it ate 100 calories worth of leaf, in that case, the plant material. Again, about half of that would be gone, basically to poop, right, feces. 15% of that is actually incorporated into the body of the caterpillar, which is then available for, you know, the predator to eat that caterpillar. And again, about 35% is lost to cellular respiration. So again, those are just details. I'm not going to ask you those specific numbers. I'm just trying to illustrate this idea of, again, moving up the trophic level is why we lose so much energy and biomass along the way. So any questions about that? All right. So again, talking about the energy pyramid that I just showed you previously. Again, like I'm saying, now you can just see it in writing. Those energy pyramids, I can't speak today. Those energy pyramids illustrate the energy loss within each transfer of the food chain. Right? So again, this is why the pyramid is bigger at the bottom and smaller at the top, because as you go from each level to the next, you're losing energy and you're losing biomass. And again, here's that number, that one number that I've asked you to memorize so far. About 1% of sunlight is available for primary production, right? The rest of it's lost. About 10% of that energy is then available at one trophic level to the next. So there's another number you need to know. And let me just say that a different way, a way that makes more sense. And if you had my Bio 108 class, you probably already know this. But when you go from one trophic level to the next, about 10% of that makes it. That will be a test question. That's the number you need to know. Of course, it definitely depends on the specific ecosystem and the specific organisms. So the actual numbers are somewhere between 5 and 20%, depending on, you know, exactly what you're looking at. But as far as we're concerned, as far as the test is concerned, only about 10% of energy makes it from one trophic level to the next. So any questions so far before I show you a slide that kind of illustrates this concept? All right, so there we go. Again, just as an example, if there's 1 million calories of sunlight that are hitting this particular ecosystem, only about 10,000 calories of those calories are incorporated into the biomass of the plant. And of those 10,000 calories, or kilocalories of biomass in the plants, the producers, only about 1,000 of that makes it up to the primary consumers. And of that 1,000, only about 100 make it up to the secondary consumer, and so on and so forth. So again, these numbers you don't need to memorize, the 1 million, 10,000, 1,000, 110. These are just examples, but you do need to know, again, when you go from one to the next, right? So when you go from 10,000 to 1,000, you're losing 10%. Or you're only getting 10%, right? You're losing 90%. So any questions about this? All right, very important concept. And also, it's funny this is happening today because this is big. I've seen this big push on social media, and I haven't even looked and see if it's true. I think it's probably exaggerated. So someone suggested that we should start eating more insects. And in some cultures, they're already doing that, so it's just a normal thing. And then other people are flipping out because, you know, hey, eating insects is gross, in my opinion, and their opinion too. But yeah, so this is why people are saying things like, yeah, we should eat more insects, which I don't agree with. But I do at least admit it would be better for the environment because, you know, the higher you go on the food chain or in the food pyramid, the less energy there is, right? The less efficient it is. Because to get there, again, you lost 90% of your energy each step you made up the pyramid. So again, any questions about this slide? All right, so again, thinking about this concept, the energy that is available to the top level consumer is very small compared to the energy that it was available to the lower level consumers, which is what I just said, but now you can see it in writing, right? So again, as you go up, each step, you know, there's less and less energy that's available. And again, this is why Again, not trying to beat the dead horse here, but yes, it is technically better for the environment to eat. Well, the bugs is one thing, but also vegetarian. I try not to eat as much meat because for health reasons, environmental reasons, but I'm not a vegetarian. But yeah, and that's why vegetarianism would be better for the environment anyway. So any questions about this slide? All right. Move forward here. Let's talk about ecosystem energetics and human resource use. So basically, what we're going to do next on this next bullet point is kind of talk about the stuff we've already talked about, but now we're going to talk about it in the context of ecosystems, specifically for human resource use. So not just things in general, but let's talk about how humans use them. So in other words, the dynamics of energy flow that we just talked about also apply to humans, right? So this isn't just some nature thing. This is also how we work. And I was hinting at that earlier when I was talking about vegetarianism and eating bugs. So I'm going to have a slide coming up. I'm going to show you two different production pyramids. And they're all based on the same model used to construct the ones from the previous ones. So here we go. Again, it's the same thing I mentioned earlier, but now it's just a graphic for it. And I'm not trying to convert you to vegetarianism, but it is a fact, again, that vegetarians have a smaller ecological footprint because of trophic level efficiency, right? So that amount of corn to feed that amount of humans, right? Unless the humans are getting that energy through the cow that ate the corn. But anyway, just an example. Any questions about that? All right. Let's talk about chemical cycling. Before I get into it, I'll go ahead and tell you what this is going to be about on the exam. First, I'm going to give you the general scheme of how chemicals are cycled, because remember, let me back up a step again to remind you. Big picture of what we're talking about right now here is that energy flows through ecosystems, which we just got done talking about, and chemicals, matter, right, are recycled in ecosystems, and that's what we're talking about now. Before I jump into it, again, first I give you a general scheme of how all chemicals are cycled, but then we'll get really specific and talk about the carbon cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. For the exam, you're going to need to know the difference between them. Specifically, I'm going to ask you, like, where does the carbon come from? Where does it go? Same with the phosphorus. Where does it generally come from? Where does it go? And same for nitrogen. Where does it generally come from? Where does it go? So for the exam, those are the things you're going to need to know the difference between them. And you'll see what I mean here once we get started. So again, as you already know, life depends on the recycling of chemicals, right? We need photosynthetic organisms to be able to make new organic material. We need the ability to eat it and break it down, right? When an organism is alive, its chemical stock changes continuously as nutrients are acquired and waste products are released, right? So again, as you're alive, you are always just you, sure, but that old adage where they say you are what you eat, that's true, right? You are literally the things that you've eaten and drank. That's what you're made of, right? You digested it, your body turned those molecules into cellular portions, and it's just you now. Anyway, atoms in an organism at depth are returned to the environment by decomposers. This is especially true when we don't talk about humans, right? Most humans are usually embalmed or cremated, but when we talk about other things, when they die, they usually just rot right away. And that replenishes the inorganic nutrients that the producers use to build new organic matter. This is a really long-winded way of saying it's all the circle of life, right? All the stuff you've already learned about. Right? You eat things when you're alive, you drink things when you're alive, you incorporate that into your body, you excrete some of it as feces or urine, but it's part of your body, and then when you die, you decompose and it goes back into nature. Stuff you already know, right? So that's the big general scheme of chemical cycling. This is a good picture, a good example of that from the old textbook, I believe. But in case you can't tell what you're looking at here, that's a dead tree that's laying sideways, and there's a live tree growing on top of it, because there are things decomposing that dead tree and breaking those molecules down and providing new, smaller molecules that alive plant can use to make it, to grow. So the circle of life. All right, here we go. The general scheme of chemical cycling. Chemical cycles involve biotic and abiotic components. So I told you this earlier, and I'm saying it again, but now I'm saying it in a different way with a different word. Like I said, for the exam, you need to know the difference between carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen cycle. Remember, and I said specifically you need to know where they came from and where they go. But now there's a different word for that. Instead of saying where they come from and where they go, what I mean by that, and this is how the exam is going to be, what is the biotic reservoir for the carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen? And what is the abiotic reservoir? So one that you're very familiar with, we'll come back to that. But remember, again, biotic reservoir is basically the living stuff, right? So if you talk about biomass, we are a biotic reservoir, right? When you breathe in, you're breathing in oxygen, right? Let's say that a different way. When we go through cellular respiration, as you already know from previously in the semester, when you're breathing out that carbon dioxide, right? Well, when the carbon's in you, it's in the biotic reservoir. But as soon as you breathe it out and it's in the atmosphere, it is then in the abiotic reservoir. So make sure you know the difference between the biotic and abiotic reservoir. This, I don't necessarily like this. You definitely don't need to study this. That's not going to help you, I don't think. This shows the general way that things go between the abiotic reservoir and the biotic reservoir, right? That's the general scheme. If I were you, I wouldn't even study that. The only reason I even included it was because your textbook did, and I teach out of the textbook. So here we go. Again, the biogeochemical cycles that you need to know, and this is at a global basis, are carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen. We're about to discuss all three separately, and you need to know the differences between them. Specifically, what are the abiotic and biotic reservoirs for carbon? What are the abiotic and biotic reservoirs for phosphorus? And what are the biotic and abiotic reservoirs for nitrogen? So here we go. Carbon cycle. This is a big one. First of all, you're already slightly familiar with this because a lot of it involves photosynthesis. So carbon has an atmospheric reservoir. That's what you need to know. What is the abiotic reservoir? The big abiotic reservoir for carbon is the atmosphere. That's where most of it is. Right? So most of the abiotic carbon, right? Most of the carbon that's not in a living thing, like the carbon in us, is not abiotic, it's biotic, right? So the stuff that's not in living stuff mostly is in the atmosphere. You need to know that for the exam. There are some other abiotic reservoirs. So fossil fuels is an example of an abiotic reservoir, which is an interesting one when you think about it, because fossil fuels came from basically plants that rotted. I won't say rotted, but yeah, old plants basically turned into oil. So it is technically an abiotic reservoir, but it used to be biotic. Anyway, there's also some dissolved compounds in the oceans. But again, for the exam, this is what you need to know. Carbon's main abiotic reservoir is the atmosphere. So how does it cycle between the biotic and abiotic, right? The way it does that, as you already know, is through photosynthesis, right? Photosynthesis takes it from the abiotic into the biotic, right? When plants take carbon dioxide out of the air and turn it into glucose, that's going from abiotic to biotic, and that is, again, photosynthesis. And cellular respiration, as you know, is the opposite, right? So when things break down carbon, glucose, for example, and then that's released as carbon dioxide, that is how we go from the biotic back to the abiotic reservoir. So nothing new here. This is all old information for you, at least it should be. So any questions about this slide? All right, the next word for attendance is tree. All right. Here's a picture. You definitely don't need to study this because, again, for the exam, the big picture is this. What is the main abiotic reservoir for carbon? And it's the atmosphere, right? Everything else, yeah, you can study it if you want, but as far as the exam is concerned, that's what you need to know. What is the major abiotic reservoir for carbon? It is the atmosphere. But again, you can look at it, study it if you want, and you can see how it goes from one thing to the other, but I'm not really worried about that. Any questions? All right, really quickly, let's talk about the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus does not have an atmospheric component, right? So there's no phosphorus in the air. So what is the major abiotic reservoir for the phosphorus? And this is what you need to know for the exam. It's rocks. As far as we're concerned, it's rocks. So again, remember for the exam, you have to differentiate between the three. Carbon's major abiotic reservoir is the atmosphere. Phosphorus, it comes from rocks. Any questions about that? It's pretty simple. I'm not going to ask you these details. We'll talk about it very quickly. Phosphates move from land to water faster than they're replaced because what happens is you get rain wears down the rocks, rain goes downhill, right? Water goes downhill. It brings the phosphorus with it, and therefore, again, we're losing less or losing the phosphorus in the ecosystem. Another thing that may contribute are soil characteristics. They may decrease the amount of phosphate available to plants. A lot of times, soil pH, for example, can change how much phosphorus is absorbed by plants. And as a result, phosphate is a limiting factor in many terrestrial ecosystems. And this is why when you use phosphate, there's often when you use fertilizer, it often has phosphate in it, in addition to nitrogen, but we'll talk about that here in a second. So again, for the exam, this slide is largely unimportant. What you might need to know, if anything, would just be this bullet point here. Phosphate is a limiting factor in many terrestrial ecosystems. So when you think about the basics of what an ecosystem needs, primary consumers, they need carbon dioxide and water and sunlight, right? But also, we didn't talk about this when we talked about photosynthesis, they also need phosphate. So that's new information for them, right? Phosphate is a limiting factor. And of all that stuff, it's usually they're not short on carbon dioxide, they're not short on sun. Sometimes they're short on water depending on the ecosystem. But again, generally speaking, the limiting factor here, the thing that's keeping them from growing, is a lack of phosphate. Any questions about that slide? And one more thing before I move forward, I just remembered. We did talk about limiting factors, but it's been a while. So to remind you what a limiting factor is, what was the example I gave last time we talked about this? It was a cookie. I said something about a cookie bakery, right? There's this bakery that makes cookies, and every day they're just getting trucks of, chocolate chips in, and they're getting trucks of butter and trucks worth of sugar, but they only get 1 dozen eggs per day. The eggs would be the limiting factor, right? You need all those ingredients to make the cookies, but you've got a ton of what you need, and you only have 12 eggs a day. So eggs would be the limiting factor. So again, that's what a limiting factor is. Are there any questions about this before I show you a slide that kind of illustrates the information on this slide? All right, there we go. And once again, just like when I showed you that picture of the carbon, and I said you didn't need to study that, same with this. You don't need to study this either. What do you need to know for the exam as far as this is concerned? The major abiotic reservoir for phosphate is in the rock, right? So for carbon, it's the atmosphere. For phosphate, it's in the rock. Any questions about this slide? All right, let's talk about the nitrogen cycle. We're doing good. We might be able to finish this chapter definitely in time, and maybe even have time on Friday to do an exam review. We'll see. Anyway, nitrogen cycle. Let's go through it really quickly. Nitrogen's different than the other two we talked about because it has 2 major abiotic reservoirs, and you need to know both of them: the atmosphere and the soil. So now that we've talked about all 3, we can say the atmosphere is not unique, right? Because we know carbon also has an atmosphere abiotic reservoir. But the soil, that's a new thing as far as we're concerned, right? So we haven't talked about soil yet being an abiotic reservoir, at least not a major abiotic reservoir. Here's another number I might ask you. You might need to know this one. The atmosphere, our atmosphere, is about 80% nitrogen gas. Right, so when you breathe in, everybody likes to say you breathe in oxygen and you breathe out carbon dioxide, which is sort of true. You breathe in for the purposes of getting oxygen, and you breathe out for the purposes of getting rid of your carbon dioxide. But what you're really breathing in and breathing out mostly is just nitrogen gas. But here's the thing. Unlike carbon dioxide, plants cannot use nitrogen gas, right? Nitrogen gas is useless to plants. And remember, plants need it so that they can build these organic molecules, so then we can eat them, and then we can use them. So how does it work? And this is something you definitely need to know. And this is it's not the first time. Anyway, nitrogen fixation. So remember, in carbon, when we talked about the carbon cycle, you did need to know the names of the processes that help carbon go from the biotic to the abiotic and vice versa, right? So when we talk about carbon, it was photosynthesis that took carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it into the biotic reservoir. For nitrogen, it's called nitrogen fixation. You need to know that. What you don't need to know is anything past that. So yes, I wrote it on this slide because your book talks about it, but these details you do not need to know. First of all, you don't need to, man, I can't talk today. First of all, you don't even need to know that nitrogen gas is N2, right? So that's not that you need to know this, but that's two nitrogen molecules triple bonded to themselves. You don't need to know that. And again, the other details, technically what nitrogen fixation does, it takes nitrogen out of the atmosphere and converts it to ammonia, which is NH3. And then that ammonia then gains a hydrogen proton, and then it becomes ammonium, which is technically NH4+. So again, none of that. You don't need to know any of those details. The point here is a lot of nitrogen in the air. Plants can't use it, so there's this process called nitrogen fixation that changes it to a form that plants can use. So any questions about that slide? We're going to talk a little bit more about nitrogen cycling here. All right. Most nitrogen comes from biological fixation performed by two types of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. I'm going to put a question mark next to this, because meaning I'm most likely not going to ask you about it, but we'll talk about it anyway. So these two types, some of them live symbiotically in roots of plants, and we've talked about this previously, actually, and they supply the host with usable nitrogen. And then there's also some free-living bacteria that aren't symbiotic with any other species. They're just doing their own thing. Excuse me. So again, maybe I'll ask you that, but probably not. What you definitely need to know is, again, the process of taking nitrogen gas, which is useless to plants, and changing it to a form that they can use is called nitrogen fixation. So any questions about that side? All right. And here's a picture of what we talked about. And again, you don't need to study this. What do you need to know for the exam in this one? You need to know the major abiotic reservoirs for nitrogen are the atmosphere and the soil, right? You need to know that. And you need to know that the process of taking nitrogen out of the abiotic out of the atmosphere and changing it to a form that plants can use is called nitrogen fixation. And then finally, one more new thing that I didn't have in writing, but you can see it now. The opposite of nitrogen fixation is denitrification. So that's when we take nitrogen that is in the abiotic reservoir, the biotic reservoir, and being able to change it, put it back into the atmosphere. So the same way we can take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and change it to a form that plants can use, we can also put it back into the atmosphere. But again, the big ones are everything to the right. So you definitely need to know nitrogen's major abiotic reservoir in the atmosphere and the soil. You definitely need to know the process of taking it out of the atmosphere is called nitrogen fixation. And maybe I'll ask you about the opposite of nitrogen fixation, which is denitrifying. Anyway, any questions about this side? All right. So your book also points out that humans have been disrupting the nitrogen cycle by adding more nitrogen than natural processes do. And the two major sources of nitrogen, at least for humans, are combustion of fossil fuels and agricultural practices, right? So when we burn, when I drove here and burned gasoline, I was adding nitrogen to the ecosystem. And also agricultural practices, which basically we're just talking about fertilizer, right? So the same way we need phosphorus in fertilizer, we also need nitrogen. And it's a problem. And you guys have already had, what was that? Lab 11, you saw that video, right? The first part of that video was talking about all the nitrogen that was, well, and phosphorus too, but that was in chicken feces, also some human feces, right? And that was bad for the Chesapeake Bay. Anyway, any questions about this slide? Oh yeah, and then one last thing. Well, first of all, let me put an X to this. We talked about it, but I'm not going to ask you the two major sources of nitrogen. You don't need to know that. You also don't need to know this, but it is at least worth mentioning. Some of this nitrogen does escape to the atmosphere, and it forms something called nitrous oxide. Not that you need to know what nitrous oxide is, but it does contribute to global warming. So anyway, any questions about this side? As far as the exam is concerned, it's a very important side. So speaking of phosphorus and nitrogen, and all that stuff we just talked about with the Chesapeake Bay. Let's really quickly talk about nutrient pollution. So the growth of algae is limited by low nutrient levels, especially phosphorus and nitrogen. Well, a lot of things, not just algae, but in this discussion, we're using algae as an example, right? So there's not a lot of phosphorus, there's not a lot of nitrogen. Those are the limiting factors for algae. So what happens is humans come along and they mess it up, right? So we are putting extra phosphorus into the ecosystem. We're putting extra nitrogen into the ecosystem. And it's really weird when you think about it. It's not necessarily common sense, because I'm telling you that plants need phosphorus and nitrogen, right? It's a good thing. We need phosphorus and nitrogen. However, too much of anything is a bad thing, right? And this is why we have something called nutrient pollution. So again, common sense would tell you, hey, phosphorus and nitrogen is good, and it is. But again, too much of it basically turns it into pollution, as you know from the first portion of that video from the lab. There's some picture of some algae growth that's gotten out of hand there. So let's talk about these nutrient pollution. Again, phosphates and nitrogens, right? So phosphate pollution comes from agricultural fertilizers. It comes from runoff of animal waste, like the chicken farms you learned about. Sewage treatment plants, like Blue Plains, again, from the same video. And phosphate pollution of lakes and rivers results in heavy growth of algae and cyanobacteria, right? So again, common sense might say, oh, that's good. We need algae. We need cyanobacteria. We do. But again, too much of anything is a bad thing. So for the exam, let me think here. I'm not going to ask you where phosphate pollution comes from. I'll say this is what results in heavy. And I might ask you what it results in. Again, the point here is too much of a good thing is a bad thing, right? So that's what phosphate pollution is. Too much of a good thing. Same with nitrogen. As far as we're concerned, it's the same thing. Phosphate pollution and nitrogen pollution is basically the same thing for a 100 level non-major biology course, because it just does the same thing. It's a limiting factor in the ecosystem. So when you have too much of it, it's a bad thing, right? Same story. Just like with phosphorus, I'm not going to ask you where the nitrogen pollutions are coming from. I will mention this, and again, I might ask it. I won't get this specific, but I might ask this general question because you've already been exposed to it from the video. There are things called dead zones. And again, I'm repeating this. You've already saw it in the video. But in these dead zones, what happens is, you get all this extra algae growth because you've been putting in all these nutrients into the water, which again might sound like a good thing, but then what happens is the algae dies, and then things decompose. We've got bacteria that decompose the algae. But the problem with that is those things that decompose the algae use up a lot of oxygen. And then that causes what we call dead zones, right? Dead zones are called dead zones because there's basically no oxygen in there, and it kills anything that needs oxygen, which is almost everything, right? There's a picture, a good example. So you can see where all this stuff comes from that gets in the Gulf of Mexico. Even the Canal River, it's on there, right? The Canal River connects to the Ohio River, which connects to the Mississippi, which makes its way to the Gulf of Mexico. And long story short, so right, even the people fertilizing the golf course at Berry Hills are contributing to this problem, just as an example. Anyway, any questions about this slide? Again, sorry, really quickly, I didn't even mention this. What we're seeing here is the dead zones, right? These are dead zones at the mouth of the Mississippi because, again, all that nutrient pollution means you have a lot of algae. Algae dies, it gets decomposed, and then we lose oxygen. Any questions about that? All right, last word for attendance will be hot. And you know what, I will at least, let's just do the introduction to this. That way, when we get back on Wednesday, we can jump into these concepts. So many environmental problems are caused by humans. Go figure. I would say most of them are caused by humans. When I first started teaching, this was a new meme. I don't know if you guys remember, you're pretty young. Do you guys remember the water situation? That was 2016, it had to have been. But there's that spill. Yeah, so that's just a great example, right? So anyway, the point being, again, this is the introduction of what we're going to talk about on Wednesday. What we're going to talk about on Wednesday is basically humans' impact on the environment, right? So we're going to talk about the bad stuff that humans do and also the good stuff, specifically conservation and restoration biology. So yeah, once we get back on Wednesday, we'll jump into those topics. You guys have a good day. Remember, there's no lab I'll be online if you need me, if you help with your old labs, but there's no lab this week. All I'm doing is reusing your highest lab grade. So you have nothing to do, unless you want to. Oh, and if you're watching a video, so none of you guys here, or none of you online right now, but for the video, might as well put it and say it verbally because I write it down every time. Make sure if you're sending the words after watching the video, include a question. Pick one question and ask me about, the concepts that I just covered. One, because maybe you actually do have a question and I can answer it for you. And two, it helps demonstrate that you paid attention and understood the video.